Hello, YouTube. This is An American Thinks. I'm back again and finally ready to tackle the big question of how I believe the Song of Ice and Fire will end. It's been quite a while building up to this point, and in case you've missed anything or need a refresh, I've put together a playlist of the preceding theory videos that provide a background for how I think the series will end. Now, we do have a few indications from outside the scope of the prior videos in this theory series. The first one I'll discuss here is probably the most discussed elsewhere, and it's more thematic in nature, but since this is my comprehensive take on the subject, I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention this. Our author has already hinted at the ending of this story in the title of his work, A Song of Ice and Fire, which is a take on the Robert Frost poem, Fire and Ice. It reads, "Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction ice is also great and would suffice." So we have themes of the world ending, of desire, and of hate, and it's not much of a stretch to look at our story and see that George has laid these themes on us pretty heavily and consistently throughout. In fact, if anything, it's been only escalating as the story has progressed. Now, obviously, this is just discussing the story in broad strokes, and we want to start getting a little more specific than this. However, keep this poem in mind as we start working our way through the theory. The second piece of evidence is the Waterstones photo leak that contained George R. R. Martin's story summary. This is getting close to a decade ago now, and I assume that most of the fan base has at least heard of this, and probably a lot of us have dissected the letter fairly thoroughly, so I don't want to spend too much time on it here. I'll leave a link in the description below if you want your own more thorough investigation. But we ought to at least discuss it a bit because it is a strong indicator from the author himself. First, it's worth noting that the letter was written in 1993 and George was midway through writing A Game of Thrones. So, as you might expect, some of the things George describes in the letter simply haven't happened in the story. For example, he originally viewed the novels as a trilogy of 700 to 800 manuscript pages. He envisioned Sansa marrying Joffrey and having his child, and Tyrion will besiege and burn Winterfell, and Arya will fall in love with Jon Snow, and Jaime will claim the Iron Throne after killing everyone ahead of him and blaming it all on Tyrion, and Tyrion will eventually fall in love with Arya for an angsty love triangle. Honestly, after reading some of the ideas that George had at the time, a part of me really wants to read the plots that George originally had, and a part of me is really glad I'll never read them at all. However, a lot of the larger plot points discussed in the letter have played out in the book series already, or are obviously building to that point. He had already planned for the major war between the Starks and Lannisters, for example, and he knew Ned and Catelyn would both die. Robb would win a series of victories and would ultimately die as well. And Dany would use dragons to unite the Dothraki, which in a way she somewhat has, and would eventually invade the Seven Kingdoms, which she seems to be working towards. Tyrion will travel and eventually switch sides, which he seems headed towards. And finally, he says that the end will feature a climactic battle between the others and the Night's Watch, and draw together characters and plot threads in a huge climax. And of course, while this hasn't happened yet, it certainly seems to be foreshadowed now for nearly the duration of this series. Feel free to share any thoughts you have from this letter. I've watched a few videos on the topic, and it's always interesting to me to hear other people's take on it. However, for the purposes of this theory, there isn't a huge amount of valuable information to glean from it. It looks like most of the major plot points that George had in mind were either ultimately discarded or had already come to fruition by the time the letters were leaked in 2015. I guess you could say that Dany hasn't officially invaded Westeros yet, and that Tyrion hasn't officially switched sides yet, but I think we all pretty much suspect that this is going to happen. With all of that said, I do think it's worth noting that the major climactic movements in the story that George outlined in the letter hold true to the theme of the Ice and Fire poem. If you're scratching your head a little bit over what I mean, consider this. The poem Fire and Ice likens desire to fire and hate to ice. And the fifth line of the poem mentions the world ending twice. And now I think that by this point most fans have accepted the symbolism of Dany thematically or even literally representing fire and desire, and the others representing hatred and ice. Through Dany's POV, we get loads of evidence of why Dany would represent fire and desire, and In my prior theory video, I discussed why I believe the others hate humanity and want to see humans annihilated. And so we see why Westeros is facing two existential threats, one from the Dothraki invasion led by Dany, her fire and her desire, and one from the others and their ice and hatred, and hence we have the Song of Ice and Fire version of the world ending twice. And thirdly, we do have evidence provided by the Game of Thrones HBO series. And having said that, I know that dozens of you are now dutifully clicking in the comment box to let me know how wrong I am. And although the comments would certainly help the algorithm find this video, just hold on and hear me out for a second. We do know that in the course of creating the show, D&D had a lot of direct interface with George R. R. Martin. In fact, it might not be a stretch to think that they've had more time with him on topics such as character and plot than just about anyone else. I mean, maybe you could argue that some editors might come in first place, or Elio Garcia and Linda Antonsen, but certainly D&D ranked very high on the list. Now, having said that, it is a given that the show is an adaptation and not a literal translation of the book series. Like most book fans, there are a lot of pieces of the final season that I don't think will feature in the book series. But as I've hinted before, I do think there are some pieces that will. For example, after the airing of Season 6, Episode 5, I put out a short analysis of the episode that predicted that Hodor holding the door would feature in the books. And not very long after, I heard that George also confirmed this. I don't think I deserve very much credit for this, for a variety of reasons. I think it's a fairly easy conclusion to make that Hodor's origin story was the creativity of George R. R. Martin and not D&D. It is, however, an example that D&D apparently had very detailed conversation with George about the characters and the plot, and that at least some of these points did feature in the show. Another one I'll throw out here, since this is ostensibly my theory of everything, is the death of Rickon. I've been expecting for some time that Rickon is going to be a casualty of the greater plot, if for no other reason than because it will cause several of the main protagonists and the readers to suffer. George R. R. Martin's leaked summary noted that only Jon, Arya, and Bran will be main characters from the Stark children, and the show went ahead and killed Rickon, so the indicators are all there. It's still kind of a bummer, as I like that little guy. But let's step back and take a more broad strokes analysis of the show, particularly the climactic movements of the show. Similar to my analysis of the Fire and Ice poem and the leaked George R. R. Martin summary, the show also follows a climax that plays out over two primary movements: the Battle of Ice that takes place at Winterfell, and the Battle of Fire that takes place at King's Landing, with the ultimate conclusion of Bran becoming king. And here's where the show, I think, both gets George R. R. Martin vision right, but also gets it very, very wrong. What's right? Well, the vision of Fire and Ice becoming the two existential threats to the world, and also Bran becoming king, George has basically confirmed that one as well. But what's wrong? Well, basically the way that it all comes about. I spent quite a while in this series hammering on George's personal philosophy about war and violence, and his disbelief in the paradox of using war to achieve peace. It's not really my personal theory. He talks about this topic very directly in many interviews and guest talks. And really, as readers, we're all pretty blind if we don't see this playing out before us in the books. War and violence breeds hate, which breeds more war and violence, which breeds more hate. And this is why the version of the story that the Game of Thrones show gave us is inherently flawed, because in George R. R. Martin's world, characters who use violence in pursuit of their goals never achieve the ends that they desire. Their use of violence inevitably leads to their own downfall. So essentially, D&D provide viewers with a bastardized version of the Song of Ice and Fire, a version twisted to suit the desires of the human viewing audiences in our world, in the same way that the Legends of the Last Hero and Azor Ahai have been twisted to suit the desires of human audiences in Westeros. And yes, that is my segue to start discussing these two legends, because I believe the final two climactic acts of the book series will essentially be two retellings of these legends. Are you ready for this? Let's go. The Battle of Ice to be fought in the north is a retelling of the story of the last hero, with Bran positioned to take the role of the titular character. All of the major plot points are there. Bran's journey is taking place at the onset of the new Long Night. He journeys north with a small company, having to confront a variety of trials related to being north of the Wall, and eventually finds the Children of the Forest. Now, the way that this legend is told during the time of the books, when the last hero finds the children, he somehow gets assistance from them and is able to defeat the others, thus ending the long night. And the people who hear this story seem to take it for granted that this means defeating the others as in some kind of climactic battle, such as the Battle for the Dawn. But again, we have to keep in mind that this story is written from the philosophy of George R. R. Martin, and in that philosophy, defeat doesn't come from winning battles. War breeds hate, which breeds war. So if the last hero had gone on to fight the others in a literal battle, he would simply have been playing into a greater cycle of war and hate which would have kept perpetuating and would have never ended in peace. In fact, the others' use of resurrecting whites to serve in their armies is a beautiful visual metaphor for resurrecting old hates in order to perpetuate wars. But we know that somehow the long night ended in peace, because supposedly the others had not been seen in Westeros for thousands of years by the time our story takes place. So the question is, if ice serves as a metaphor for hate, then how do we win the war against hate? And specifically for the legend of the last hero, how would the children somehow assist in winning the war against hate? Well, I think in our story, overcoming hate is accomplished by coming to understand the adversary, and specifically through the use of the weirwoods. In learning that they are not so different from each other, the humans and the others can arrive at a peace that does not involve the annihilation of one side. I believe this is what happened roughly 8,000 years ago, the last time the others and the humans came into conflict, and it is what must happen this time around in order for Westeros to avoid ending in ice. And in brokering the peace agreement, Bran is inevitably set up to become king, because he is the only one with sufficient understanding to lead the human realm into a new peaceful future. This is probably the biggest disservice that D&D ever perpetrated against the reading audience, in taking a story that has been beautifully written and so well positioned to deliver a valuable conclusion, and instead bastardizing the ending into yet one more story of good guys winning by killing all the bad guys. It's perhaps the biggest unintentional meta-level reference as to why Westeros has the problems it has, and perhaps as to why our own world has the problems that it has. And it's also why the second climactic act of the show falls completely flat, at least in my view. The humans have just defeated the others by fighting a battle of annihilation against them. Why then should we suddenly be opposed to Dany fighting a battle of annihilation against people who oppose her? There is no moral logic between the two climactic movements. And instead of playing a pivotal role as peacemaker, Bran is reduced to playing the role of live bait in the show, which maybe works if you want to lure others into a god's wood, but it doesn't make an exciting resume for somebody who's going to serve as king. So I suspect that in the books, the conflict with the others and the humans ultimately culminated in a peace, in a way similar to the pact between the children and the first men. And I think that the humans and the others by the end of the book series will form a pact where the others will resurrect the wall and return to the lands of always winter, and the humans will remain on their side of the wall, and both sides agree not to antagonize each other from their various respective sides of the wall. And yes, I just walked us into a whole new realm of Theoryland, and I didn't really have a better place to fit all of this in, so we may as well press pause and address some of this setting and plot-related territory now. Yes, I do think the wall was created by the others, or at least with the assistance of the others. I think they're the easy candidate by having the best understanding of how to manipulate ice, and I think that any lasting peace with the others has to have a way of delineating territory between the humans and the others, both in geographic terms and in terms of consciousness. And by that I mean, whenever you have a whole group of people who have a strong telepathic power, which the others pretty obviously have, you run into a major problem of personal agency. How can you trust that your own thoughts are really your own, and that anyone is really acting in their own best interest and out of their own free will? How do you know your consciousness isn't getting hijacked, like Bran does with Hodor, or like Varamir tries to do with Thistle? My suspicion is that the wall was raised as a part of a peace agreement between the humans and the others, either around the time of the last hero or possibly around the time of the 13th commander of the Night's Watch, because I can easily see Starks from around that time claiming that the Lord Commander had become the Night's King, not so much because he fell in love, but because he was manipulated telepathically. On the other hand, pun fully intended, the others would have their own concerns. I spent a lot of time in this theory laying out the idea that many, or possibly all, of the various observable telepathic, or what we might simply call magical, powers in the story are ultimately tied to genetics. The Starks in particular have a huge family lineage of assimilating potent genetic material into their bloodline, including that of the children, the others, the Warg King, probably some giant blood if you look hard enough, and finally, most recently, the Stark wolf blood has been joined with the dragon blood of the Targaryens in the form of Jon Snow. This creates a huge problem for the others, because prior to the creation of the Wall, the others could have access to the same genetic material that's circulated around Westeros, or at least in the north. So neither the humans, the children, the giants, the others, or anyone else who might be out there could gain an asymmetrical genetic advantage, so long as all the other parties are paying attention. However, once the wall is constructed, the others would have been specifically excluded from the future genetic melting pot in the rest of Westeros. So I think the peace agreement between the humans and the others would have looked something like this. We all agree to create a buffer so that you will know that we can't telepathically attack you. However, you will have to agree to share your genetics with us. And over the intervening centuries, the meaning of this agreement has been lost, and the human side has not been sharing its genetics with the others. In fact, it is very likely the opposite. This probably actually casts a lot of light on the vows of the Night's Watch not to father any children. It also probably casts light on why Starks have turned down opportunities to marry into the Targaryen family, and casts even more light on why Jon Snow is a pivotal character in the story, and why so many of the major powers in the story have an interest in him. And since I'm pointing this out, let me make one final conclusion about Jon Snow that I've been building up to for essentially the entirety of this series. I maintain that Jon is the product of Rhaegar and Lyanna, and that everyone is interested in him because he carries both wolf and dragon genes. However, if this is true, then we all need to read the remaining books while keeping in mind that dragon riding and dragon hatching are traits that are only passed through X chromosomes and not Y chromosomes. Most likely other powers such as skin changing are also passed through X chromosomes as well, but since we have the most well-defined ancestry of the Targaryens, the genetics of dragon abilities is the easiest to prove. And Jon, being a male, could only have received Rhaegar's Y chromosome. So Jon cannot be a dragon rider due to genes he inherited from Rhaegar. So if at some point in the future books it turns out that Jon can ride dragons, that has absolutely massive implications for what dragon riding and dragon hatching actually is and where it actually comes from. This is something that was totally unaddressed in the show, although I will admit that the larger genetic plot lines that lurk in the background of the books are also essentially unaddressed in the show. But regardless, when I saw Jon riding Rhaegal, my jaw about hit the floor. Analyzing this in retrospect, I wonder if this is really a huge reveal that D&D heard from George in their discussions, or whether it was just something D&D cooked up on their own for fan service, because, of course, most fanboys and fangirls want to see Jon and Dany riding dragons together and winning battles and falling in love. So, this was all my roundabout way of saying that the Battle for the Dawn, both in history and as it is likely to be played out in the final books, ends up being a story about making peace, and not a story about destroying enemies. Now, having addressed the last hero and the Battle for the Dawn, ice, and hate, let's talk about the legend of Azor Ahai and about fire and desire. If you read much of George's work, you'll find he does not serve up very many happy endings. In fact, just off the top of my head, I can't really think of one that I would specifically call happy, although some are more agreeable than others. I mean, Bitter Blooms isn't exactly a sad ending, but it does leave a lot of unanswered questions for the reader, so it isn't exactly satisfying either. I think these factors are trademark characteristics of George's writing style, of how he does conclusions. In some ways happy, in many ways sad. Not entirely explained. A general feeling of wanting more. In short, inconclusive conclusions. But he delivers them so well. With that in mind, I do not think that everything I've been bringing up in this theory series is going to get explained in the books. Very likely more questions will be unanswered than answered. That's just George's way. At the very least, it leaves us more value in rereading. But there is one thing that I am pretty sure is going to happen. Dany is going to die. And I don't think this is just because he has to kill a sympathetic POV character in order to deliver a bittersweet ending. I think that Dany's mentality is going to play out much as it does in the show. I do not think that she is a character who is going to be willing to understand her enemies and search for peace. I think her desire for revenge and for conquest is going to prove too strong. And unlike the ending given to us in the show, I think that the battle for the dawn and the peace with the others is going to serve as a strong juxtaposition as to what can be accomplished when we work in pursuit of peace, and also what is at stake when we are adamant in pursuit of war. In the show, it's just Tyrion's puppy eyes and sad face that hang in the balance. In the books, I think it's going to be the destructive cycle of hate and war that hangs in the balance. Everything that everyone had to work so hard for is going to be jeopardized because one character is unable to overcome their own flaws. And we all realize that if this is allowed to happen, then we are going right back into the cycle of war and hate. So this is where the legend of Azor Ahai comes in. This is another legend that I believe has been bastardized by time and is now perceived as a legend about how to forge a really great sword in order to win a war. However, if you look at what the story says symbolically, that isn't what it's about at all. In the legend, you have a great warrior, Azor Ahai, laboring over and over to create a sword, the sword being symbolic of a weapon or the means of waging war. He goes through greater and greater efforts to do so, as in he tries harder and harder to wage his war, but is ultimately unsuccessful. It is only when he slays his wife, Nissa, which symbolically is an object of desire, that he is finally able to win his war. And remember, in the philosophy of George R. R. Martin, winning a war means achieving peace, not destroying enemies. So what makes Azor Ahai a great warrior is not the fact that he figured out how to forge an amazing sword, but the fact that he was able to overcome his own desires and achieve peace. So I think that in the final act of the book series, someone who desires Dany is going to have to drive a sword through her heart in order to achieve peace. In the show, of course, this was Jon, and I will grant that he is a likely contender. I've also had some thoughts that George might have a Dane character do this with the Sword of the Morning. This would be especially poignant if the sword really does grant the ability of telepathy. But at the same time, we don't have a Dane who we've gotten to know as well as we know Jon. So it seems like the primary protagonists ought to be the ones who are going to play out the final acts. With all that being said, I think this is actually a part of the story that the show does get right. Dany very likely is going to die, and this is going to be the act of a hero conquering not their adversary, but rather, as George often says, they're conquering the conflict in their own heart. So there we have the two-act conclusion. The last hero in the battle for the dawn, Azor Ahai and Nissa, ice and fire, hate and desire, and the grand theory of everything finally brought to a conclusion. But having said all this, I have to admit that I have been deceiving all of you just a little bit, because I did call this my grand theory of everything, but underpinning everything in this theory is my concept of particle X, and I haven't talked about what I think it is, or why I think it does what it does. I've thought about covering it in this series, but I think it's something I'm going to save for a rainy day. Right now, the theory of particle X is pretty tinfoil, because there really isn't direct evidence for it in the books. It's just something I'm inferring from other things I've observed in the books. And if I'm honest, I don't think George is likely to give direct evidence for it in the upcoming books either. But who knows? Maybe he will. Or maybe he'll give direct evidence for something else that will disprove Particle X altogether. But for now, I'm keeping that theory on hold, maybe at least until Winds of Winter. But who knows? If I get enough requests for it, I might put it out there sooner than that. Much like A Song of Ice and Fire, this theory series has taken much longer to complete than I anticipated. It's been almost 2 years now, and they've been good years, but a lot has changed for me in that time frame, and as most of you can probably tell, my posting schedule hasn't been what you might call regular. So I think what I'm going to do is open up the comment section for questions and make a Q&A video about anything you might have in mind following this series. And then I'll most likely wait for Winds of Winter before I get into the theory business again. Honestly, I kind of shot my best shots in this series anyway, so I'm hoping that Winds will give me some more to work with. So with that in mind, drop me your questions in the comments below. I'll give it some time and let the questions accumulate and try to answer the best ones when I'm able. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time. Oh yeah, and since this didn't fit in anywhere else, I also have a pet theory that this story isn't being told from multiple viewpoints, but rather is being told from the viewpoint of a weirwood observing the collective memories of the various protagonists. It doesn't really change anything, I guess, and I doubt if we'll find out this is true. It's just a hunch I have.